Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're digging into something really fundamental in the construction world, contracts.
Yeah, they're basically the rule book for any project, aren't they? They define everything.
Exactly. They lay out who does what, the owner, the contractor, designers, subs, suppliers, everyone. It's the core agreement.
And each one is unique, defining specific obligations for each party involved.
The really crucial part, though, is how choosing a specific type of contract shapes the whole project, especially when it comes to risk.
Absolutely. It's all about how that financial risk gets divided up. If one person takes on more risk, someone else carries less. It's a balancing act.
So the big question underlying all this is, how does the contractor get paid? And related to that, how is the financial risk spread around?
Right. And that leads to the main split you see, fixed price versus reimbursable contracts.
Fixed price being where the cost is pretty much set up front and reimbursable.
Yeah.
Well, that tracks the actual spending.
Exactly. Though, it's not always purely one or the other. Lots of contracts end up being a bit of a hybrid, mixing elements of both.
Makes sense. So who's driving this decision initially?
Well, typically, the owner really needs to think about this early on, like during the feasibility stage. They look at their goals, their constraints.
Like budget.
Yeah, like if the budget is really tight, they'll probably lean towards a fixed price. But if the project scope is still a bit fuzzy, maybe something more flexible, like a reimbursable contract, makes more sense, even with the cost uncertainty.
Okay, so budget and scope clarity are big drivers.
Yeah.
What else influences this choice?
Oh, quite a few things. The whole project delivery method matters, whether it's a competitive bid or a negotiated deal.
How much risk the owner wants to hold on to.
Right, and how good the design info is up front. Incomplete plans make fixed prices tricky.
And the project itself, right. Public versus private, simple build versus something super technical.
Definitely. All those factors play a role. So usually we boil it down to four main types people talk about.
Okay, what are they?
You've got your lump sum contract, cost plus a fee, cost plus with a guaranteed maximum price. People usually just say GMP, and then unit price contracts.
Lump sum and unit price.
Yeah.
Those sound like the fixed price ones, based on estimates.
Generally, yes. The price is fixed, either for the whole job or per unit.
Whereas cost plus and GMP are about paying back the actual costs incurred.
That's the core idea, yeah. The owner reimburses the contractor for what they actually spend, plus some kind of fee.
All right, so our mission for this deep dive is basically to unpack these four types, understand how they work, and really focus on how they distribute that financial risk.
Exactly. By the end, you should have a much clearer picture of this really crucial piece of the construction puzzle.
Okay, let's start with probably the most familiar one, the lump sum contract.
Right. The classic fixed price deal. The contractor agrees to do a specific scope of work for one single price, decided up front.
How do they even arrive at that single price? It seems like a lot of guesswork.
Well, it takes really careful estimating. They have to figure out all the costs, labor, materials, equipment, everything. Then they add their overhead, the cost of running your business, and their profit.
And that total becomes the bid price.
Yeah. And that price is supposed to cover everything needed to get the job done as intended, even things that might not be explicitly detailed but are reasonably inferable.
Inferable? Like what?
Okay, say the plans show nice carpet in all the main rooms, but forget to specify flooring for a tiny closet. It's reasonable to assume the owner doesn't want bare concrete there, right?
Huh, right. You'd expect similar carpet.
Exactly. So the contractor should account for that small bit of carpet in their lump sum price. It's about anticipating the complete scope. That foresight, or lack of it, directly hits their bottom line.
Which brings us to the risk. This sounds like the riskiest setup for the contractor.
Generally speaking, yes, because that payment is fixed. If their estimates are off or unexpected problems pop up that aren't covered by specific contract clauses,
They eat the extra cost.
pretty much. Imagine they underestimated how long the foundation would take, or the price of steel suddenly jumps, or they just miscalculated the amount of drywall needed. That all comes out of their potential profit.
But the flip side is, if they're really efficient or get good deals on materials and come in under budget.
Then they make more profit. That's the potential reward for taking on that risk.
So why is this type so common then? What are its advantages?
Well, familiarity is a big one. People understand it. It's also the go-to for competitively bid projects.
Which is good for the owner, right? Easy comparison.
Yeah, owners can compare bids apples to apples, theoretically getting the best price. And if an owner has a really strict budget, lump sum offers that cost certainty. Low financial risk for them.
Assuming the design is solid.
Yes, if the design is really complete and clear, Competitive bidding on a lump sum basis can often result in a lower cost. It's also great for simpler, more formulaic projects. Think small retail stores, maybe tract housing.
Okay, but what are the downsides? You mentioned flexibility.
That's the main one. They're pretty rigid. If the owner wants to make changes mid-project, it can get complicated and expensive. You have to carefully document the change, price it out. It adds admin overhead.
And it really hinges on having good drawings and specs up front.
Absolutely critical. If the design info is vague, incomplete, or confusing, especially common in renovations where you don't know what's behind the walls, the contractor has to make assumptions.
Which can lead to arguments.
Definitely. Confusion, conflict, change orders, increased costs. It can get messy if the scope wasn't crystal clear from the start.
So essentially, with lump sum, the owner is trying to push most of the financial risk onto the contractor's shoulders.
That's the basic dynamic, yes.
Can owners make it a bit fairer, though?
Oh, sure. Smart contracts often include clauses to limit the contractor's risk for specific unknowns. The classic example is unforeseen ground conditions.
Like hitting unexpected rock during excavation.
Exactly. The contract might say if you hit more than X cubic yards of rock, we'll adjust the price. It puts a boundary around certain high-risk unknowns.
So the contractor doesn't have to inflate their bid massively, just in case.
Precisely. They can bid more competitively, knowing there's a safety net for certain really unpredictable things, while the owner still retains overall budget control.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's switch gears now. What about the cost plus a fee contract? How does that shift the risk?
Right, cost plus. Here, the owner agrees to pay the contractor back for all their actual documented project costs.
So materials, labor, subcontractors, all that.
Yep. Plus, on top of reimbursing those costs, the owner pays a separate fee. This fee is meant to cover the contractor's overhead, their general business costs, like office rent, admin staff, and their profit.
And how is that fee decided? Is it fixed?
It can be. It could be a fixed lump sum that they agree on upfront, or sometimes it's calculated as a percentage of the actual construction costs.
Okay, right away that sounds much less risky for the contractor. They get their costs covered plus a fee.
Generally, yes, assuming the fee is enough to cover their overhead and provide a reasonable profit. The big trade-off, though, is transparency.
Meaning the contractor has to open their books.
Pretty much. They need to show the owner detailed proof of all their spending, which leads to the owner's main worry.
Which is?
Not knowing the final price tag. Since costs aren't fixed, the owner doesn't have that upfront budget certainty. And there's always that nagging concern. Will the contractor be careful with spending?
Especially if their fee is a percentage of the cost. More spending equals a bigger fee.
That's the potential conflict, yes. Though reputable contractors obviously wouldn't exploit that. But it's a structural concern owners have.
Does this type have downsides for the contractor too?
The big one is paperwork. Justifying every single expense for reimbursement can be a major administrative burden. Lots of documentation needed for every payment request.
So given those points, why would an owner choose this route? When does cost plus make sense?
Well, think about situations where speed is paramount. Maybe the owner needs to get construction started before the design is 100% finished. That's called fast tracking.
You can't get a fixed price for work that isn't fully designed yet.
Exactly. Cost plus allows that flexibility. It's also much easier to make changes along the way. And sometimes, if the scope is really uncertain, a cost plus contract might actually lead to a lower initial price because the contractor doesn't need to build in huge contingency allowances for unknowns like they would in a lump sum bid.
So good for complex or fast-moving projects.
Yes, or projects with genuinely hard-to-predict risks. It offers maximum flexibility.
You mentioned the fee covers overhead and profit. Can we just clarify what overhead usually includes?
Sure, it's the contractor's general business expenses not directly tied to this specific project site. So their main office rent, utilities for that office, salaries for headquarters staff, insurance, things like that.
And the profit is just their earnings on the job.
Right. And like we said, that fee structure fixed amount versus percentage of cost really changes the incentives and risk profile. It's a key negotiation point.
Okay. So cost plus offers flexibility but lacks cost certainty for the owner, which naturally leads us to the next side, the cost plus with a GMP.
You got it. The Guaranteed Maximum Price, or GMP contract, is designed precisely to address that owner anxiety about open-ended costs in a pure cost plus deal.
It sounds like a hybrid, almost.
It is, in a way. It kind of blends cost plus reimbursement with a price ceiling.
So how does payment work? Still tracking actual costs?
Yes, The contractor submits invoices for their actual verified expenditures, and the owner pays them, just like in cost plus.
But
There's a cap. The total payments to the contractor for costs, not necessarily including their separate fee depending on structure, cannot go above that pre-agreed GMP amount.
and if costs do go over the GMP,
The contractor generally has to cover the difference out of their own pocket, or perhaps their fee. That's the guarantee part.
okay, that gives the owner some protection. What if they come in under the GMP? Is there savings?
Ah, that's where it gets interesting. Usually, yes. Most GMP contracts have a shared savings clause.
Meaning,
Meaning, if the final cost is less than the GMP, the owner and the contractor typically split the savings according to some pre-agreed formula, maybe 50-50 or 70-30.
oh, so that gives the contractor an incentive to be efficient and save money, even though it's cost plus based.
Exactly. It aligns their interests with the owner's desire to control costs. And usually in a GMP contract, the contractor's actual fee is structured as a lump sum, not a percentage, which adds another layer of cost predictability for the owner on that component.
So when is this GMP approach most suitable?
It's really good for large, complex projects, maybe ones that need to be fast-tracked. You get the flexibility of cost plus for dealing with evolving designs or unforeseen issues, but the owner gets that budget protection from the GMP ceiling.
And the shared savings potential helps keep everyone motivated.
Right. Assuming the GMP is set realistically and the sharing clause is fair, it can be a very effective model for collaboration.
Okay, one more main type to cover, the unit price contract. This sounds different again.
It is. Unit price contracts are typically used when you know the type of work needed, but not the exact quantity.
Like what sort of projects?
Think heavy civil or engineered projects. Highway construction is a classic example. You know you need to excavate soil, lay gravel, put down asphalt, but predicting the exact cubic yards of soil or tons of asphalt needed up front can be really difficult.
Because the ground conditions might vary, or the exact road alignment shifts slightly.
Precisely. The quantities aren't easily pinned down at the start. Lots of heavy equipment involved, materials measured by volume or weight.
So how does bidding work if you don't know the total amount?
Instead of bidding one total price, contractors bid a fixed price per unit of each major work item.
So like dollars per cubic yard of excavation.
Exactly, or dollars per ton of asphalt, dollars per linear foot of pipe installed, whatever the relevant units are for that project.
And payment is based on.
Payment is based on the actual measured quantities of work completed, multiplied by the contractor's bid unit prices. The quantities are usually measured and agreed upon as the work progresses or upon completion.
Who provides the initial quantity estimates for bidding then?
The owner provides those. They'll issue bid documents with their best estimate of the quantities needed for each item. Say, we estimate 10,000 cubic yards of excavation.
And contractors use those estimated quantities to calculate their overall bid for comparison.
Yes. It allows for a competitive bidding process, even though the final total cost isn't fixed yet. But remember, the final payment depends on the actual quantities.
Okay, so who takes the risk if those initial estimates are way off?
Generally, the owner bears the risk of quantity variations.
Can you give an example?
Sure, let's use that excavation example. Owner estimates 10,000 cubic yards. Contractor A bids $6 per cubic yard. Contractor B bids $6.50. Contractor A looks cheaper based on the estimate $60,000 versus $65,000.
Right.
But what if, during construction, they actually have to excavate 12,000 cubic yards because of unforeseen conditions?
So contractor A gets paid $12,000 times $6, which is $72,000.
Exactly. The owner ends up paying more than their initial $60,000 estimate because the actual quantity was higher. The owner carries the risk of that quantity overrun.
So it feels like a mix again. Fixed price per unit, but total cost varies, like cost plus.
That's a great way to put it. It's a hybrid. The unit price itself is fixed, like lump sum, but the final payment depends on actual quantities, like cost plus. So the financial risk tied to how much work there is gets shared, though the owner takes the brunt of quantity miscalculations.
Okay, we've really focused on payment structures and how they shift risk. But construction has tons of other risks, right? Weather, shortages, price spikes, site accidents.
Absolutely. Loads of things can go wrong, and ultimately, almost all of them have a financial consequence for someone, the owner, the contractor, or both.
And the contract is the main tool for deciding who bears which risk.
It is. That's a primary function of these agreements, allocating those risks.
So just to recap the risk balance, lump sum puts most risk on the contractor.
especially the risk of getting the costs wrong in their estimate.
And cost plus puts most risk on the owner.
Primarily because the final cost isn't fixed, and there's that potential issue if the fee is percentage-based.
You could almost visualize it as a sliding scale, right? Risk shifting from contractor to owner as you move from lump sum towards cost plus.
That's a perfect analogy. GMP and unit price sit somewhere in the middle, sharing the risk in different ways.
Is there an ideal point on that scale? What's the goal for risk allocation?
Well, ideally, you want a reasonably balanced allocation of risk, something that feels fair to both sides.
Why is that important?
Because fairness tends to foster cooperation rather than an adversarial relationship. If one party feels like they're carrying an unfair amount of risk, it can lead to cutting corners, disputes, claims, just a less efficient project overall.
So a good contract rewards work fairly and also rewards taking on specific risks appropriately.
Exactly. Remember, part of why an owner hires a contractor isn't just for their building skills, it's also to transfer some of the project risk, but it needs to be equitable.
Balanced risk means smoother sailing generally.
Generally, yes. Contracts that load excessive risk onto one party often backfire. Now, when we talk about risk management overall, there's managing the risks themselves, things like safety protocols for accidents, maybe contingency planning for weather.
Things you try to control or mitigate.
Right. And then there's risk allocation, which is what the contract does, deciding who is financially responsible if a specific risk materializes.
Is there a principle for how to allocate specific risks?
Yeah, a key principle is to assign a risk to the party best able to control or manage it.
Okay, like safety.
Safety is a great example. The contractor is typically on-site daily, directly managing the workforce and site conditions, so they're usually best positioned to manage safety risks. Therefore, the contract usually assigns that responsibility primarily to them.
What about something like design errors?
That risk is often best managed by the owner, who typically hired the architect or engineer. So responsibility for design flaws often rests initially with the owner, though they might have recourse against their designer.
So the contract should make these responsibilities crystal clear up front.
Absolutely. Clarity avoids arguments later. It sets expectations and helps everyone work together knowing who handles what if things go sideways. It fosters collaboration instead of finger pointing.
And I assume similar principles apply between the main contractor and their subcontractors.
Very similar, yes. The structure of those agreements mirrors these owner-contractor dynamics just one level down the chain. We can definitely explore that subcontracting relationship more later.
Okay. So where do we go next in understanding these documents?
The next logical step is to look more closely at the actual contract documents themselves, starting with the main agreement document that ties everything together.
Great. So wrapping up today's deep dive, we've explored the four big players in construction contracts: lump sum, cost plus fee, cost plus GMP, and unit price.
We've seen how they differ fundamentally in payment structure and, more importantly, how they distribute financial risk between the owner and the contractor.
And we've touched on how project-specific budget, complexity, schedule, design, clarity really guide which contract type makes the most sense, a choice that directly impacts your financial outcome and the contractor's duties.
Definitely.
So here's something to think about. Reflect on how this allocation of risk plays out.
Yeah.
If you were involved in a project as an owner or maybe a future contractor, how would understanding these dynamics change your approach? What are those unseen forces baked into the contract language that really shape whether a project thrives or struggles beyond just the physical construction itself?